The defender of Gotham, the Dark Knight himself, is dead, which means that the city is under threat of someone else taking over. And so it's up to Batman's apprentices to take up the mantle and take back the Knight. And that in itself is quite a big role. And it's also a great metaphor for the game itself. Like, can these Gotham Knights actually be able to take upon something that the Arkham games have been doing so well for so many years? And I have a real fear, just like how Batman has a real fear of bats, not baths, like in some cases it might be.
Bats! Bats! See, that makes sense, because you're afraid of bats, so you dress like a bat, so you could frighten your enemies. Dress like a...
Bats. Baths. Taking a quick shower is just as refreshing and uses 1/3 the water. It's wasteful!
But yeah, I was incredibly fearful that the Gotham Knights would not be up to standard that the Arkham games have set, because after all, the storytelling is incredible and the kick-ass combat was so good in those last games that I didn't know that Gotham Knights would be able to come up to that standard. And so I've asked myself this question, is it maybe an irrational fear? Well, I've actually been playing the game for the last week and I have finally concluded that unfortunately this game is very much overshadowed by the fact that it's not as good as the Arkham games. However, I will say still that I think it's epic and still worth your time. Let's get into the game and why I think that.
Master Bruce saw more. He saw greatness. He saw potential. He saw the future of Gotham.
What's up guys, welcome to That Freaking Geek, and in today's video I'll be talking about something special. I'll be talking about Gotham Knights. The embargo has lifted and I'm finally able to talk about this game, and it's an absolute honor. Thank you so much to Warner Brothers through Gamefinity for giving me this code for review. It is such an honor, and like I didn't have to sign the NDA. I would never have shared anything. You can trust me. I know we only met over the internet, but there's people full of people that you can trust on the internet, so it would have been absolutely fine. But anyway, I'm gonna get into it. I've been playing for the past week and I have some thoughts, to say the least. Let's start off with the story. The game starts out with this incredible cutscene of how exactly Batman died. And I won't spoil anything here, but let's just say it's classic Batman the way he goes out. And that's exactly it. Like I said in the beginning, the goddamn Bat is dead. And so because of that, the villains are running rampant within the city and they want to take the streets for themselves. But Batman left a legacy, a family, a group of people who have the skills of what it takes, but unfortunately they are doubtful that they'll be able to do what it takes to be something as incredible as the Batman. Robin, Batgirl, Nightwing and Red Hood all have their own insecurities that drive the plot of the story being whether or not they are good enough to fill the shoes of the Batman. But not only that, they were very close to Bruce Wayne himself, and so all of that drives this plot forward. And so you get Dick Grayson, who thinks he'll never be good enough to be the leader. And then you get Bob, who basically feels she's inadequate and she has some daddy issues. And then you get Jason, who feels like he can never hold in his anger like his mentor could. And then of course you get Tim, who is still a teenager, he's still very young and thought that he had so much more to learn from his mentor. But what holds them all together in the story is actually Alfred. Good and faithful Alfred is the glue that keeps this family together. With the Court of Owls, a cult that was controlling Gotham from the very dark depths, ended up being a reality, and with all the other villains running rampant in the city, the Gotham Knights have a lot to juggle outside their personal issues. And that's exactly it. The premise to the story is really good. Batman is dead, Gotham Knights need to step up their game. But unfortunately, the Arkham games have such a standard about how good superhero games need to be. And let's be clear here, this is not a follow-up from those Arkham games, and that would have allowed more different types of story with its characters kind of come out of this, but unfortunately that isn't the case. And I mean, one little difference is that Arkham games happen over one night, this happens over many nights, which is a little bit more realistic, I guess. Since this time they had to juggle 4 different heroes and you can only play as one hero at a time, the game feels very disconnected what happens within the clock tower versus what happens out on the streets. And you would think that their messy personal lives will start to bleed in to their crime fight personas, but what ended up happening is just generic reactions to what is happening out on the streets. So while the character interactions on the streets feel unauthentic, the ones that are happening within the clock tower do have better moments, but they're these random moments and they end up feeling like something out of a CW superhero show, like something like from Arrow or Flash, and so decent, but not nearly good enough. And so the way that the story progresses isn't something I really enjoy. Even the stories with the various amount of villains that you encounter, they also feel very disconnected, and that's because every time when you play a different mission with one of the villains, you always find yourself playing as different characters. And so when you kind of interacting with the villains, they feel very generic in the sense of like they're referring to things that happened before, but you're playing as different characters on the different missions, and so it never really adds up about like what they're saying. It doesn't really make sense. And one good example would be the Mr. Freeze storyline, where Mr. Freeze, you'll kind of fight him as one character. By the end, he's like, hey, you should kill me, it'll be easier. And the next mission, when you fight him again, he wants you to defeat him again, he's like, hey, you should have killed me. And I'm like getting confused because I'm like, wait, you referred to that to a different character, like this is not the same character played before. And so all of that kind of feels very disconnected. And on top of all that, none of the villains get fleshed out. You don't understand why they're doing their evil. Like Mr. Freeze has an incredible backstory. None of that gets explained. It just looks like this evil person doing evil things. And Mr. Freeze is not the exception. He's the rule with all the other villains. Like, just not fleshed out. Even the Court of Owls, which was, according to the marketing, the main villain within this game, they were something that I was very excited for. They looked like they were smart. They were always one step ahead. But none of the story showed that, and it's actually beyond me how Batman himself never noticed them. And that's exactly, overall, the story had a lot of potential, but it was ultimately disappointing, and that's mainly thanks to the fact that you got 4 heroes that you need to juggle, and that in itself makes the whole storyline feel very disconnected and ultimately dull. But what wasn't ultimately dull, which was a big surprise to me, was the combat. Let's get into it. Let's address the elephant in the room. The Arkham games set the gold standard when it comes to superhero fighting. And in those games, you focus on one Dark Knight. In this one, you have 4 different Knights who, actually, bit of a side note, wear incredible costumes. The variety in costumes is very, very cool. But back to the gameplay. The combat itself is a bit repetitive. That is at its core. However, they do make it interesting because all 4 different characters kind of feel different enough to make it kind of, alright with the repetitive at its core. However, with Batman, there was more time to refine one character, whereas this has just 4 that they need to juggle. And on top of that, like with the Batman Arkham games, there was a counter button. You would counter and then you would, counter attacked. In this one, there is no counter, you have a dodge instead. And the dodge doesn't feel as well as the Batman Arkham games. Like there was this like kick-ass like dance that you would do with Batman. In this case, it doesn't feel as fluid as it did in the Batman Arkham games. However, as you learn to time your attacks in unison with the animations, you start to feel more or less what the developers are trying to do here. A new dance that you learn. As you upgrade your abilities, as you upgrade your character, you start to get more into the rhythm that the developers want you to get into. Each hero have their own strengths, such as Nightwing, who is an acrobat fighter. Then you get Batgirl, who's a lot more of a focused fighter. And then you get Red Hood, who's a brutal fighter with some flippin' awesome furious pistols. And then you get Robin, who's a lot more of a dynamic warrior and is really like inclined to do some really kiff stealth actions. And if I had to kind of pick my favorite, that would be quite hard, considering that I think the developers have done a good job to make all 4 characters feel really, really good. But I think if I had to pick one, it would be Robin, because I really enjoy the way that he fights and I actually really enjoy stealth within games. However, the stealth in this game isn't nearly as good as the Arkham games that have come before. Nope, the NPCs are kind of dumb, and because of that, when you clear a room, like, it's not as satisfying. And on top of that, another thing that's quite bad about the combat are the brutes. Like, these brutes are these just giant meat bags that you would have to just keep hitting to kind of peck away at their health until they hit 0, and there's nothing special about them. And on top of that, they're similar to the actual main boss fights. Like, yeah, sometimes they feel epic in the way that the animations and they kind of change the room. Like, some of them do have their moments, but ultimately they are monotonous. It's not really good. They're not fresh, they're not new. They feel like they're just walls that you kind of got to climb over. Talking about walls to get over, the traversal in this game is actually not that bad. However, you'll find yourself parkouring around the city, but more than that, you'll actually find yourself grappling through the city. And the thing is that it's nice, but it gets boring pretty quickly. And so the way the game kind of helps that is kind of gives each character their own different unique ways of traveling, such as Batgirl, who has her own kind of cape to fly through the city. And then you have Nightwing, who has a glider that is meant to be this, beautiful, graceful glide through the city. What ends up happening, it just looks like an eyesore of an overkill of an umbrella. But, talking about the city, let's talk about the incredible game world that they've created here. And that's exactly it. Gotham is an incredible city to set your game world. It has so much potential with this really cool looking architecture. Like, there's a lot of story that can be told within the city. However, what ended up happening here was a lot more generic than I would have liked. The Gotham in this game just doesn't feel like it's been lived in, doesn't feel like the inhabitants are kind of controlling and kind of manipulating the city. Like it's really pretty to look at, but what ended up happening here is just something very generic with generic like planned crimes that happen and planned activities. It doesn't feel organic within the city. The side missions within the game are these crimes that happen throughout the city, and unfortunately they are very samey and are very repetitive in nature. And so because of that, what ends up happening, it feels like more of an obligation to do them so that you kind of live up your character and collect resources, which are very convoluted, but it ends up feeling like a grind. And that's exactly it. It results in a game that feels like you're just doing it for the sake of doing it. I mean, even the main linear missions, like they also have very similar in terms of like how you go into a room and then another room, and they all have very similar designs. Nothing feels fresh, nothing feels new, nothing catches you off guard, and because of that, it feels very like samey in the way that you go through all the levels. There are some level designs where you get to go on your motorcycle and it kind of changes up a little bit, but that doesn't excuse the rest of the very samey level designs. And yeah, this isn't the most unimaginative open world this year. However, unfortunately, it just needed a little bit more layers. It just needed a little bit more to make the game feel like you're actually playing as a Gotham Knight within Gotham. Talking about the feeling of the game has pretty decent graphics. It's nothing special. However, thanks to the ray tracing and the way the lighting works in the game and some 4K because of my TV, the game looks pretty nice. Unfortunately, there isn't a 60 frames mode on this game, which has become quite controversial in the build up to this game. However, luckily for me, I personally prefer the visual mode, the mode that gives me 4K. But however, there's been such nicer games that have come out in the last couple of years that has a 60 mode, so I'm not exactly know what's going on here. The developers are kind of just doing their own thing here.
I'm tired of this, Grandpa!
That's too damn bad!
So in conclusion, Gotham Knights is overshadowed by the Arkham games that have come before. And unfortunately, my irrational fear is pretty rational. Because what happens here is that there is a story that feels incredibly disconnected, because you've got 4 heroes that they need to juggle. And so because of that, they never feel like they're organically interacting with the villains, and so when you want to bring them to justice, you're just like doing a task, you're doing what you need to do as the Gotham Knights, and none of it feels satisfying. The combat in this game is thankfully really good. It is the reason why you're going to keep coming back to it, and so if you can get past the learning curve about how the way the game works this time, you're in for an absolute treat, because with the 4 different characters, it never feels boring thanks to the way that each of them work differently. Would it be nice if we had all 4 of them like fighting together in missions? Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and because of that, while the gameplay is fun, it's nothing special. And Gotham City, while it is a very pretty city to look at, unfortunately what holds it back is its poor level design and the art direction, which leaves a lot to be desired. And you'll be grappling and motorcycling and gliding all over the map, but unfortunately that becomes a bit repetitive and you'll find yourself fast traveling every moment you can. There is absolutely fun to be had in Gotham Knights with your 4 different heroes, but that 4 character driven experience is unfortunately its downfall, resulting in mission designs that feel tiresome and a story that feels disconnected. This is a good epic game, and so because of that, I'm going to give it a 7.5. But the reason why it doesn't hit greatness, doesn't hit 8 and above, is that we have the Arkham games. Those games are overshadowing this game, and so unfortunately, it just doesn't reach those heights, and so therefore that's why I'm giving it a 7.5. But thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed this review. I hope it was helpful. It is an absolute honor that I got to review this a week in advance. Thank you so much to Gamefinity. But I also want to do a quick shout out. If you want to buy this game or anything gaming related, go head over to Kudu. They are fantastic. They're a great partner here on the channel. And so go check them out. The link in the description, the link in my bio. They're amazing, have amazing content. Please go check them out. But that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed it. See you in the next one. Cheers.